The theme today, actually Gail and I, when we looked at Winter is Coming, the Game of Thrones theme, we really wanted to focus on different aspects of Game of Thrones, this being the one about class and the struggle in society. But I couldn't help but tie it into the images of God on this Christ the King Sunday. And I focused in on the Ephesians passage because this verse, with the eyes of your heart enlightened, you may know what is the hope to which God has called you. I was feeling very drawn to this called to hope. Hope can be a hard thing. It can be a very hard thing when life is tough and you're in the wilderness. Every time I've been lost in the wilderness, no GPS, no cell phone's going to guide you directly to where you're going. True wilderness is you're quite lost. You're not sure how it's going to end up. But Paul seems to have this image that we are, maybe because of his own experience being in prison, like we are prisoners of hope. He's persistently a person of great hope that we've been called to. So here we are looking at the church today, and I love following Richard Rohr in his inspiring daily meditations. Richard captures for me the need for renewal in the church. Richard today speaks about the growing number of people in society that call themselves nuns, N-O-N-E-S. So the few weddings that I do have today, usually when I do get around to talking to the faith question to my brides and grooms, and the most common thing they'll tell me is they are nuns. Does anybody know what nuns are today? They do not affiliate with any traditional religion or person of faith. That doesn't mean that they don't believe. They might be atheists, they might be agnostic, but they just don't affiliate. Phyllis Tickle, in her great writings, has continued to challenge the Christian church to imagine that every 500 years there's like this garage sale, the Reformation we've just remembered. And in this garage sale, this spiritual letting go, that Christianity is constantly being challenged to become more inclusive, more universal, and I think actually more hopeful. So here's what I want to share with you about Game of Thrones. I'm going to ask Chris for my first slide. First of all, for those who are perhaps nuns or people who certainly don't find church the place that they necessarily would choose to go to on a Sunday or any day, Game of Thrones is a worldwide phenomenon, as I've been saying. It's one of the most popular TV series imaginable. Some Christian believers would almost say that this is the work of the devil, that there's far too much violence, brutality, sexuality, which is all true within the Game of Thrones. But we just have to open our tablets or our newspapers on any given day and realize that whether it's the male entitlement of Game of Thrones or the aggression at that time and the rape that happens is still happening today. What you see in Game of Thrones is a quest for power. And you're looking at some of the great, I'm not going to give you the story away of Game of Thrones, but these are some of the great figures of Game of Thrones, the queens and the kings, the family feuds. Next slide, Chris. So what is fascinating about this slide here, and why I think Game of Thrones is quite fascinating, is that to your right, we have what is known as the High Sparrow. Now on the internet, some people have actually put this character up with the Pope, but in Game of Thrones, he really becomes the Pope. He represents the poor of society, and he is now speaking to one of the most powerful figures in all of Game of Thrones, Queen Cersei Lannister. And believe me, nobody wants to mess with her. She is as tough as any king could ever be. But she's discovered something very important about power dynamics. The High Sparrow here, who cares only about the poor, this high sparrow has great power. And what happens in Game of Thrones is all of a sudden, the poor are lifted up with the help of the queen here in some ways. But ultimately, what Game of Thrones reveals is that religion can become the opium of the people. And ultimately, the dictatorship that they had under this queen just becomes a new dictatorship of faith militants under the High Sparrow. It reveals to those who watch this faithfully that religion can be as hungry for power and control as any political leader. Chris, the next slide. So here is a man in the Game of Thrones who is not a king, but he's kind of like a wise voice. I'm no learned man, but the best way to help the most people might not be setting in a frozen castle on the edge of the world. This is a man of great wisdom and consistently challenges the powers that be of his time to actually care about everyday real people. Next slide. Our last slide. For Game of Thrones fans, this truly, whether they've ever heard of Jesus or not, Jon Snow has become the Jesus figure of this series. Without going into great detail, I mean, there's been everything from whether you call it resuscitation or resurrection. This character who's predicted winter is coming, Jon Snow, for those who follow, see a different kind of leader. They see somebody that is not driven by power, wealth. He's actually driven by compassion on humanity. And so why I think Game of Thrones is so important is that as people who struggle really to understand what faith or religion can do for them in their life today, the writers of this series are revealing what's really at the heart of faith. In the words of James Forbes, he was the former pastor of Riverside Church in New York City. I like this quote. I heard James preach once. James says, "Nobody gets into heaven without a letter of reference from the poor." I like that one. Paul knows that God is a messenger of hope, and we are to reveal that and to proclaim that to one another. The great Methodist writer, and we'll sing it later in our service, says, "Hope is the blessed assurance that Jesus is mine, a foretaste of glory divine." For Paul, hope is what keeps him fighting the good fight. We don't give up on hope. So I want to tell you why hope is so important to me today. I have a dear friend who is dealing with what at some level all of us have to deal with in honest truth. He's a few years older than me, but his wife has come down with a very poor diagnosis in discovering that she has pancreas cancer. So John and his beloved are just dealing with this news, and the likes of Steve Jobs, who battled as perhaps one of the smartest, wealthiest Apple CEOs in the world, of course, fought the good fight until his death from pancreas cancer. So being with my friend this week is like standing on holy ground. And to know my friend is to know that he's had a love-hate relationship with the church. He's been in the church, he's been out of the church. He'll look at me in the eyes and say, "I don't get much out of sermons. I don't get much out of liturgy." But to his biggest surprise, and I mean this honestly, surprise, the news of his wife's sickness, he's been surprised at how beautiful the congregation have been to his wife and to him. The hopeful news is that she might have 2 years. The worst case scenario is 6 months. But then he looks at me and he says, I believe the universe, which is his image for God, the universe is teaching me something quite profound in this horrible experience. And with all modesty and humility, he looked to me and he said, you know, we all go through this life thinking what we are ultimately in control. We think we are so wise, or we're so knowledgeable, or without us, things couldn't happen. But what this diagnosis is already teaching me is that the universal might be God, the Spirit, Christ the King, is teaching him to let go. And in letting go, he has already discovered and shared that he's learning that the universe does have a power of care and compassion that is quite profound. Hope is not an easy thing. It's not Pollyanna. It's not hoping for a brighter tomorrow. And hope is in the wilderness. It's pretty muddy at times. You're not sure what tomorrow's going to bring, but you know that you have today. And as Richard Rohr and the great theologians, the great, really wise teachers continue to point to, is the greatest hope is in living now, in this moment. Paul makes it pretty clear. We have a hope that we are to pass on. It's not always easy. It's not always comfortable, but it helps what seems unbearable to bear. So I want to close with this. I want you to ponder what you're hoping for these days. What is it that you hope for? What helps you hope when it's hard to hope? And I want to close with these great words of the Reverend Martin Luther King, Christ the King Sunday, my favorite. Some of his favorite words. A few years ago, I was in Atlanta at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Could hear these words as he preached them just weeks before he died. He loved his congregation deeply in Atlanta, and this is what he said in this sermon. He said, if Christ is king, what does that mean? If Christ is ruler of our lives, Dr. King told them, then my Nobel Peace Prize is less important than trying to feed the hungry. If Christ is king, then my invitations to the White House are less important than me visiting the prisons. If Christ is king, then my being Time Magazine's Man of the Year is less important than that I try to love extravagantly. How are things going to end? What happens after we die? I don't know, and neither do you. But we do know the shape of the story a loving God is writing. If Christ is king, we know Jesus waits at the end of that story. For Game of Thrones people, that's Jon Snow, by the way, that he will see us and know us, and that if we have done what he taught, Jesus claims us as his own. And I have to say, that is enough for me. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Thanks be to God. Amen.